What do you want? Huh? What do you want?
Welcome back to Horror Movies. In a few seconds, you're going to listen to a frightening tale narrated by me. Fear awaits you. Watch out and take care. Natasha calls Bobby's partner, Sam, on the phone and asks her about Bobby. She complains that Bobby took her baby from her house, and now she doesn't know where Bobby is. Sam doesn't know about Bobby's whereabouts either, and as soon as the call comes to an end, Natasha leaves Bobby a voicemail. Bobby replies with a text, informing Natasha that she's gone to their mother's place at Jupiter House. On their way, Natasha is determined to simply pick up the baby when she gets to Jupiter House and leave, without speaking with her mother Barbara. Mrs. Eves asks Natasha when she last saw her mother, and Natasha tells her that it was about 15 years ago, during her grandmother's funeral. Bobby is in the field with the baby, choking on a cookie when Natasha finds her. She finally vomits the cookie, and Natasha confronts Bobby for leaving with the baby. Then she lifts the baby from the ground and starts to leave. Bobby follows Natasha, urging her to open up and tell her exactly what is going on. Natasha reiterates that the baby is not hers, and she goes on to explain to Bobby that the baby fell from a cliff and she caught him. She tells Bobby that the baby is dangerous, and warns her that if she tries to take him, she'll be eliminated by the baby. Back in the car, Mrs. Eves tries but fails to turn on the engine. She tells Natasha that the baby is responsible for this, and that he wants to keep them there for much longer. Natasha then steps out of the car and meets her mother Barbara, who is now standing in front of their car. Barbara assures Natasha that someone would come and check what is wrong with her car. She tells Natasha that she can come over to the house and wait if she wishes. Barbara also tells Natasha that she'll do her best not to interact with her, since it's obvious that Natasha hasn't come to see her. As soon as Barbara leaves, Mrs. Eves asks Natasha if there is a lake nearby. Natasha says yes, and Mrs. Eves tells Natasha that they will eliminate the baby at the lake. Natasha becomes more suspicious of Mrs. Eves and asks her why she's doing this and what exactly is the nature of her relationship with the baby. Mrs. Eves insists she's trying to help Natasha save her life, but Natasha ignores her and starts to walk away. Mrs. Eves tells Natasha that she'll be dead by the next day, but Natasha ignores her. In the house, Natasha feeds the baby while the baby cries. Barbara tells Natasha the baby is crying because she is tired and needs to get some sleep. Just then, a group of children comes into the house and Natasha starts to play some game of tricks with the kids. One of the kids, Sally by name, boldly asks if being a lesbian is the reason Bobby doesn't have a baby, a question that puts Bobby in some kind of awkward situation. Bobby is finding it difficult to respond to the question until Natasha interrupts and saves her from the embarrassment. Soon the children leave the house, and while Natasha feeds the baby, Sally comes in and asks Natasha for a cigarette. Natasha turns to Sally in surprise, and the girl promises to take Natasha to Barbara's workshop. Sally then leads Natasha into Barbara's art workshop, where there are lots of sculpture pieces. Again, Sally asks for a cigarette, and this time Natasha gives a cigarette to her. Sally leaves the room shortly after. Meanwhile, Mrs. Eves enters the room and finds Bobby. She tells Bobby that Natasha wants her to put the baby to sleep. However, Bobby tells Mrs. Eves that if Natasha needs her help she can reach out herself. Bobby then leaves the room. Barbara enters her workshop and is surprised to find Natasha inside of it. After exchanging words with her mother in the workshop, Natasha returns to the room with the baby. The baby won't stop crying, and frustrated, Natasha yells at the baby until Barbara comes in and urges Natasha to get some sleep. At night, Bobby enters the room, finds Natasha asleep and the baby crying. Bobby somehow manages to put the baby to sleep. And shortly afterwards, Mrs. Eves sneaks into the room and tries to smother the baby with a pillow. Somehow, Natasha starts to suffocate in her sleep just as Mrs. Eves tries to smother the baby. Natasha manages to kick out Mrs. Eves and accuses her of trying to kill her and the baby. Mrs. Eves says she didn't know Natasha would be hurt. Natasha calls her a liar and continues yelling at her. Mrs. Eves mentions the name Helen and Natasha asks her who Helen is, before walking out of the room. Mrs. Eves then goes outside, carrying the baby and mentioning the names of the women who have had the baby at some point. Mrs. Eves tells Natasha that the baby wants to reveal some things to her. She holds the baby before Natasha, and Natasha starts to see a vision of these other dead women who had the baby at some point, and there is Mrs. Eves taking pictures of these women with her camera. In the vision, there is a younger version of Mrs. Eves calling Helen by the seaside. Helen happens to be the real mother of the baby. Forcefully married to Jack, Helen wishes she could always be with Noor, whom she truly loves. And Noor is in fact the same person as Mrs. Eves. But here she is younger, and known as Noor. At dinner, Jack's father announces to the family that he has bowel cancer and may have just about a year to live. The phone rings, and Helen answers the phone. She speaks with her secret lover Noor, and Noor tells Helen she'd drive in by midnight so that they can leave together. While in bed at night, Jack tells Helen he wants them to have a baby, so that he can put a smile on his father's face, even if it's just for a moment before he finally dies. Jack forces himself on Helen, while she lays almost motionless on the bed. Later that night, Helen sneaks out of the house and leaves with Noor, who is waiting for her nearby. In the morning, Helen takes Noor to the cottage beneath the cliff, the same cottage where Natasha met with Mrs. Eves. Helen tells Noor that she inherited the cottage from her aunt, and Jack doesn't know about it. Some policemen, sent by Jack, arrive at Noor's place during a party, looking for Helen. The people in the house help resist the policemen and prevent them from getting into the house. Later, Helen tells Noor that she's pregnant. Noor suggests that they move to Liverpool and stay there for a while. However, Helen is abducted at a hospital when she goes for a checkup and forcefully returned to her husband's house, where she is kept against her will until she finally gives birth to a baby boy. Helen is deeply traumatized by the experience, and develops disgust for her own baby, whom she refuses to breastfeed or carry in her hands. Jack's father finally dies, and on the day of his funeral, Helen stabs her caretaker to death while Jack is away. She's about to leave the house when she meets Jack at the staircase. She pushes Jack down the stairs, eliminating him. Helen finally reunites with Noor in the cottage. She tells Noor that the baby is not hers. Noor threatens to eliminate Jack, but Helen tells her that Jack is dead already. Later that night, Helen wakes up and finds the baby sitting on the floor of the cottage. She has no clue how the baby found his way to the cottage. She gets up, walks out of the cottage and drowns herself. Noor soon wakes up and finds the baby crying in the cottage. She steps out, calling Helen but does not get any response. When Noor returns to the cottage, she can't find the baby anymore. In the present time, Natasha wakes up from the vision and finds her mother carrying the baby. Mrs. Eves tells Natasha that they have to leave. So Natasha gets up and asks her mother to give her the baby, but Barbara won't give her the baby. Then the children, now possessed by the baby, run towards Barbara, snatch the baby from her and run away. Natasha, Bobby, and Mrs. Eves enter an abandoned room and find the possessed children sitting on the floor, drawing a picture of Helen drowning. Sally is the one carrying the baby. Natasha asks Sally to hand the baby to her, but Sally says the baby wants his mother. Soon, the children start to stab themselves with some sharp objects and Sally runs out of the room with the baby. The adult members of the community meet the children at the lake and try to recover the baby from them. But the children start throwing stones at the adults, causing a number of the adults to collapse and pass out. Natasha lies down somewhere in the woods, closes her eyes and starts to have some flashbacks of Helen. She starts to hallucinate, and she sees herself surrounded by corpses of the women who have had the baby, including Helen, who suddenly wakes up and tells Mrs. Eves that Jack is alive. Meanwhile, the children, still possessed by the dark powers of the baby, are acting violently. And Barbara nearly gets drowned by Sally. Bobby and Natasha soon appear, and Bobby starts to distract the baby in order to weaken his powers, while Natasha pulls Barbara out of the water. Soon, Natasha runs out of possible ideas of how to distract the baby, so the kids get possessed by the baby again and run after Barbara and her daughters, who enter the house and lock the door. Patricia, the social worker assisting Bobby and her partner with their adoption process, later calls Bobby on the phone and tells her that she and her partner are not yet qualified to adopt a child. Bobby is upset about the development, and she accuses Natasha of somehow being part of the reason why their request to adopt a baby was not granted yet. Bobby asks Natasha if she truly wants her to have a kid, and Natasha admits that she doesn't want Bobby to have a baby. She tells Bobby that she's terrified of being abandoned by people, and she wants a baby who cannot reject her. Natasha suggests that a dog probably would fill in that space and love her unconditionally. Bobby falls to the ground and starts crying. Barbara tries to calm the two sisters, and tries to bring up the topic of her leaving when the siblings were much younger. She tells them that their father had asked her to leave, but Natasha rebukes Barbara and tells her she's lying, and that she was the one who chose to leave. Natasha gets a flashback of her mother driving out, while her father is crying. Barbara then explains that somehow she was not able to reciprocate Natasha's innocence and love when she was much younger, and that was in fact why she had Bobby, so that Natasha can have somewhere to put her love. Bobby gets up and walks out of the room. Natasha finally meets the baby sitting in the midst of the other children who are now lying unconscious on the floor. She apologizes to the baby about his mother. She then carries the baby to her car and puts him in the backseat. She stands beside the car, and Mrs. Eves appears, walking unsteadily towards the car. Natasha asks Mrs. Eves what happened to her, and Mrs. Eves says she had a heart attack, and tells Natasha that Jack, the father of the baby, is still alive. Natasha helps Mrs. Eves get into the car, and soon Mrs. Eves starts sleeping in the back seat, next to the baby. Natasha turns on the car and drives off.
Check out the link in the description for part 3.
Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.